Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And if you want to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing, this is me very well prepared. Chapter 56 of Breaking Step. Tibs froze as lightning illuminated the city. It only lasted a second, but he hoped it would leave spots for anyone who didn't have light as an element. He still couldn't take a chance. He still couldn't take a chance an attentive guard might notice his darker form against the pale wall. Though, wow, through that and the downpour. If not for how many roofs he'd had to run to reach the brokerage, he'd have dressed in something lighter. But the city guards were more attentive to the roofs here, and many buildings had them posted to watch over them. Yeah. And many buildings had them posted. Okay, that's clunky. I borrowed lighter, but the city guards were more attentive to the roofs here, and many roofs had them posted there. To watch over them. That's to them very much close, but I don't really know how to fix that one. Thunder sounded, deafening him, and he got back to work. The window had more than the usual latch. More the usual latch those this high up settled for. It had a lock with false gate and tolerance so tight any thief attempting to pick it while hanging from the overhang would fail. The only way it could be more secure was to make it so the key needed to be enchanted, like those at his rooming house. But that would add to the enchantment. Okay, that's the end of a phrase. But that would add to the enchantment that should already be protecting the whole building. For Tibs, it was simply a question of willing the ice he had within the lock to push the tumbler appropriately, then turn, and the window pushed in quietly. It didn't disturb the strands of the weave still in place, since it was part of what they protected. The opening in that, from those pulled aside, was half as wide as the window. Another flash of lightning froze him in the process of pulling himself up. He suffused himself with earth so he'd keep his body rigid when needed. Keeping himself okay. He suffused himself with earth so he'd keep his body rigid when needed. Keeping it okay. Wow, did I go clunky on this one? His body rigid, twisted at the angle needed to pass through the gap in the weave. Once he was as far in as his hold allowed, he reached in, placed a hand on the stone wall, wrapped that in stone, and finished. With a shove, and finished? Okay, and moved fully inside. There we go. With a shove, undoing what held his hand and suffusing himself with air, he landed silently in the center of the room. Well, it should be silent. Thunder sounded as he landed, and his ears rang from it. He gave himself 6 and 0 heartbeat to ensure that, in spite of his caution and the added cover of the thunder, no one had noticed his entrance. He closed the window, and absorbed the water it had let in. He'd already reflexively kept himself from getting wet, then set about the job. Okay, I think this is going to be work better if I do it like that. But Tibbs had two jobs, one for Archer, the only one he needed to do as far as the man was concerned, and the one for himself, the one that ensured Craggle Rock would no longer be bothered, even if the Archer said the lack of coin would be enough. The contracts documented what Sebastian wanted done, as well as who the brokerage had hired to make it happen, had been mentioned in passing, as part of Archer explaining how the organization worked. Tib had to insist on answers to his questions to get the details. Those papers were required for the work to be done. Most organizations that use contracts. What? Oh, most organizations used contracts. Most organizations use contract. If one went missing, they no longer had a way to prove the work needed to happen. Archer knew where they were, and that Sebastian's contracts, as well as the ones for those hired, would be kept together as part of how they were handled. But he told Tibbs where only after he got him to promise the coins would come first, and that they wouldn't be jeopardized in attempting to get the contracts. Tibbs had agreed and found the coins were kept under the building, while the contracts 2 floors below him. The brokerage had so many coins, Archer said, that they couldn't trust the wooden floors to hold them. Okay, I don't need the all here. Tibbs was dubious about it. Coins weighed little. He could hold a handful for hours without feeling it. Even a bag of them was hardly noticeable. Because he'd promised to get the coins first, it meant getting the contracts on the way out. He took off the dark clothing to reveal a set of better appointed ones he wore over his armor. Archer had wanted him to go in without it, since it made the clerk's clothing hang not quite right. But Tibbs wasn't heading into the potential danger the job represented without protection he was comfortable wearing. And he took a stack of paper out from its hiding place. Why do you not like that? Out of its hiding? Yeah, you know what? Yeah. Out of its hiding place. Another spending he'd rather not do. And to do another spending he'd had to do, since this is how changing a couple of words, can require further changes. Another spending he'd had to do, since clerks had paper. It's no longer needed. He'd written accounts from the previous week, since those were the kind of things the paper Tibbs had seen within the guild building had. An ear to the door confirmed the people he sensed walking by. No one in the building had an element. He let go of his as the corridor emptied, opened the door, and walked out. The brokerage was filled with what Archer called bureaucrats, clerk with illusions of grandeur, which was why Tibbs had spent more on the clothing than he'd liked. They handled more money, so he imagined they had more power. He didn't acknowledge the people he passed, and they didn't him. He wore the same preoccupied expression they did. Even this late, there were a lot of them in the building. The brokerage never slept, Archer said. Tibbs had taken that to mean they were always on guard, but he'd quickly realized, as he cased the building, that it was literal. Day and night bureaucrats came and went. People dressed richly enough or too suspicious looking entered and left. He walked by guards. Some stood at attention by a door not the one holding his contracts. He was relieved to see. He sends people inside. Metal boxes. With weaves. Metal boxes with weaves through them. But didn't have the time to get details. Other guards walked around, although they seemed to be going places rather than patrolling. Tibs avoided anyone who looked like they belonged on a harsher version of his street, as did any of the clerk. The ground floor was the same set of corridors and rooms, and only different in that it had a door at one end of the central hall with an entryway where the customers sat and a less impressive door at the other end. Okay, let me redo this. The ground floor was the same set of corridors and rooms, only different in that it had one door at one end of the central hall with an entryway where customers sat and a less impressive door at the other. That one opened onto an alley, but he sensed by the sense of the other side. The other difference was that behind one door in the central hall, a guarded door closer to the front than the back, were stairs going down, the only set of them. It also had a lock on top of the being guarded. The guard had the key, and Tibs watched as a man offered a paper for the guard to read before he unlocked the door and let him in. He couldn't know what the paper said, so that was not how he'd get down. As with other corridors, it was well lit, and the oil lamps were protected from tempering by a glass cylinder only opened at the top. You know what? A glass chimney. With a glass chimney only opened at the top. You know what? If I say chimney, open at the top is kind of implied. It wouldn't prevent him from dousing them and plunging the hall into darkness, but all it would do was raise the alert, unless he could provide a justification for it, such as an exceedingly powerful gust of wind. He was in a straight hall with a door at each end, after all, and there was a storm raging outside. The wind hadn't bothered him since he had hair, but it had been strong. Not strong enough to extinguish lamps, but Tibs could make what moved through the hall strong enough it could be believed it had. All he needed was for both doors to open at the same time and at the same and the right time. And he would have his justification. The back door had a metal bolt, currently latched, but that wouldn't slow him. And since no one was paying attention as they walked by, they might not even know if it was or wasn't latched after the fact. To avoid drawing attention while he waited for someone to need to go down, he walked along the corridors on the floor. He sensed everyone moving, and it was simple to be heading towards the door each time someone slowed as they reached it. Too many people did so. Enough, Tibs was sure someone would notice how often he came by. Each time he tensed, ready to open the bolt, shove the doors open, and bowl over everyone with the storm wind. Once he'd nearly done it, but the minute stopped as he looked through the papers he held, then turned around. When the woman approached, he was already in the hall from the circuit he was already in the hall from the circuit he walked. So he saw her holding the paper as she slowed and offered it to the guard, who looked it over and handed it back. As the key went in the lock, Tibs forced the bolt to unlatch and grab hold of both doors. The key turned and the lock clicked. Darkness fell into the hall as all flames extinguished. The doors slammed open, and the wind was strong enough it could have propelled Tibs to the door, where he shoved the woman out of the way and pulled the door open. Her complaints were taken away by the storm. He sent a torrent of wind ahead of him and and snuffed the lanterns that lined the stairs. He stumbled the last step and held onto the wall as he stepped into the room's light. A woman was struggling to catch papers the wind had sent flying, and Tibs kept her distracted as he straightened himself and his clothing while continuing. He ignored her question. He didn't understand the language, but she had sounded curious, not alarmed. The hall was well lit again, but no doors guarded. The guards were inside the room by the armor some of the people in them wore. The room he wanted, the one Archer had told him held all the coins Sebastian had given the brokerage to accomplish his revenge contract, had 2 guards and 3 clerks. Wait, 2 and 3? Really? I think I'm going to have to come back and fix that. I believe it's 3 and 2. That would be a problem. He needed resolve before he reached the door. He didn't think he could wander without being questioned. He needed to deal with them without alerting those in the other rooms. He could make out faint conversation from the door, so if dealing with a guard was too loud, he'd be in trouble. He could suffocate them, but he had no way to know how long it would take. He'd unsettled one of Sebastian's thugs that way, but it hadn't taken him down quickly. What he couldn't do was only focus on them. He needed to ensure they had no way to find air, so he removed it from the entire room. The door was bolted from the inside, but that didn't stop him. He undid it before pulling the door and pushed back the surprised guard that was reaching for it. He closed the door and put metal spikes into it and the frame to ensure no one could get in easily. You know what? Ensure no one could get in. Let's leave it at that. She steadied herself and unsheathed her sword. He sent a ball of air as she locked eyes with him, and she flew back. He cursed as she quickly drew a breath before landing, then got up. The 3 clerks were by their desk, gasping for air. Okay, remain consistent. And the other guard was already still. His life essence was fine, but Tibs had no idea how long that would last without breath. Okay. The longer she lasted, the least likely it was anyone would live, he expected. So he needed to end this fast. He blocked her attack with his earth-covered bracers to protect it, then straightened his punch with the same element. She landed with a gasp, then choked before regaining control and getting to her feet, her expression more determined. Tibs told her to stay down, only for his words not to go anywhere. So it wasn't just that he could use air to bring words to him. They needed air to be. The sword strike hit him in the chest, and he looked at her, annoyed at his distraction and yet more holes in his still repairing armor. He punched her in the face, and she staggered back. She attempted another swing, her expression fearful, but she staggered again and dropped to a knee. She forced herself to stand, the determination back stronger. Tib shook his head, pointed to the floor. She came at him, sword high, step unsure. Tib stepped out of the way of the swing with ease, and the motion took her off her feet. Her sword silently slid away as she landed. Then she gasped, the fear back as she watched him approach. It wasn't only word that needed air to be, any sound seemed to. Was this what Alistair had done when he'd given them privacy? Somehow he used water to divide the air on one side from the other, preventing sound from passing. He watched her growing still and sensed for the other, cursing for the others. Cursing as he noticed the other... for the others. Cursing as the... as he noticed the guard's life essence had thinned to almost nothing. He brought back air and his gasp was loud, as was that of his opponent. No, he kicked her across the face, and she was still. The safe was a metal box, taller than he was, woven through with essence, most of it metal, earth, and purity, some air, light, and darkness, along with others he couldn't identify. No thread reached out, so the weave would be to reinforce it. If it sounded an alarm, it would come from it instead of being a trigger for something else, something elsewhere. Knowing what he now knew about air and sound, he removed it from around the safe, then proceeded to undo the weave. It resisted. Those he didn't know acted in concert to strengthen the hold against his will. So Tibs changed tactics. He poured corruption through the weave. Purity fought it, but Tibs had an unending reserve, while it only had what was within the weave. It was overwhelmed, and the rest melted away with it. Then the safe sagged, and Tibs hurried to pull the essence out. He needed the content intact. He undid the door and looked in, awed at the content. Stacks and stacks of coins bound together by leather strips. Wrapped. Wrapped in leather. I I don't know why I went with leather strips, because that makes no sense. A stack of coin with a strip would just fall apart. Um, Wrapped in letters: copper, silver, electrum, gold, and something silver-like, but with blue in it. On a shelf were bars of the same metals. On another, stacks of papers. He shoved the coins in Archer's bag, swallowing his giddiness. This had to be the most coins any rogue had ever held. Before putting the bars in, he sent one of each to his hiding place. It was the same metal as the coin, so had to be valuable. When that was all in, and the bag hardly bulged, he considered the papers. They weren't the contracts, unless the man had been wrong, and there were more stacks of them bound in leather for that. There were more. There were two more bound in leather. There were too many. And there were too many stacks of them bound in leather for that. He couldn't take the time to figure out what they were, so all went into the bag. Once he was away, and before he reached the tavern, he'd look them over. He sensed no one in the corridor, and his ears confirmed it. A glance added to that, so he exited. The woman at the desk had collected the papers and was assembling them into orderly piles. She barely glanced at him as he headed for the stairs. The lamp were lit again, and the door handle unlocked the door as he turned it. He didn't have time to wonder about the mechanism. As he readied himself for the guard, who didn't look at him as Tibs headed for the stairs heading to the upper floor. Floors plural. The hall was lit again, but people were still picking up papers and other items that had been sent flying. He couldn't take his time to go in and take the contracts anymore, but he also wasn't leaving them in the brokerage possession. Some of the other rooms under the building had even larger safes. There would be enough coins in those for them to keep paying to have Craggle attacked, no matter what Archer believed. So he needed to destroy them. Sensing the room Archer had told them about, it had many safes with weaves similar to the one he'd undone. What Archer hadn't told him was which safe it would be. The solution was simple. He'd destroy the content in all the safes. He figured fire deserved the feast. He poured it into each of them as he walked up the step, having to keep adding to it, since the moment he stopped, the weave acted to douse the fire. Again, it was fine, as he had far more essence than it. A bell sounded, rung by someone in the room, since the weaves didn't connect to anything. While fire was contained inside the safe, eagerly devouring their content, the heat it generated filled the metal walls and leaked outside. When he reached the floor, people were screaming, running away from the room. Tibs felt the heat pouring from the open door. You know what? Running away. Tibs felt the heat pouring from the open door from this. Oh, I see. This is the from. Heat pouring out from the stair. Pouring out from the stair. out of the room from the stairs. A man stopped, pointed at Tibs, and yelled something. Maybe his eyes had given him away. That was fine. Fire was useful here, too. He waved his hand, and fire licked around them. People yelled again, moving away from him. Then someone didn't. He flung fire. When someone didn't, he flung fire at them as he kept running up the stairs. He kept the fire from harming them, but everyone knew how hungry it was, and that fear was enough to scatter everyone he encountered. Guards were running after him by the time he reached the floor, and three happened to be before him. Tibs let go of fire and channeled metal, suffusing himself and pushing the essence through his armor and clothing. Hopefully, that would work to keep them intact. The sword glanced off him as he shouldered them out of his way. Then he was through the door and running for the window. For the window. Okay. This is a different paragraph. It and the surrounding wall exploded under the blast of air, and he didn't slow as he threw himself out, pushing away from the building and using air and water to form a channel below him to slide along onto the roof of the facing building. Lightning flash and the explosion of a spire a few building away was covered by the thunder that made Tibbs's ears ring. He laughed as he landed on the roof and rolled to his feet. He'd done it. Had gotten the coins, destroyed the contract, and only had 2 holes in his armor out of it. He straightened at the sound of swords being pulled out of the scabbard. Right, the roof had guards. He turned to the sound of another sword being drawn, and another. Instead of the 1 or 2 he'd expected, 7 stood in the lantern's faint light, moving into the darkness to surround him. They all looked angry. Well, he'd just broken out of a building they were supposed to be protecting, so they had reason to be angry at him. He grinned. Metal swords, and me without a weapon. This should be... The air crackled around him as 2 guards ran in his direction. He frowned at his hand as a burst of lightning jumped between his fingers and to the raindrops. Metal didn't make lightning, did it? Tibs exploded with light, and the thunder was so loud it left utter silence in its wake. And that concludes chapter 56 of Breaking Step. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter will be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read this story as well the other 2 before, they are up on Royal Road for free. If you want to read ahead of that and support me, that is on my Patreon, where it is about 20 chapters ahead. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the notes, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.